Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Go ahead and grab your favorite drink. Today we're tackling a really potent idea, one that you hear simplified a lot in the news.
Yeah, you constantly hear this thing floating around about China, like, oh, they only respect strength, not right or wrong. It's a pretty strong statement, right?
It is.
Kind of like when someone says, look, they just don't get it until you hit them where it hurts,
Exactly. And it sounds incredibly intuitive, doesn't it? It's definitely a compelling story, easy for people to grab onto.
Sure.
But is that really the whole picture? Is it actually true?
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, what does it mean for how the world deals with a rising power like China? That's the really tricky question we're going to try and unpack today.
Okay, so our mission for this Sip and Talk is basically to unpack this whole fist theory, this idea of China's worship of strength.
Yeah.
We're going to look at why it's so popular and what historical stuff and even things happening right now seem to back it up. And then the crucial part, why just boiling it all down to they only see strength isn't just, wrong, but maybe even a bit dangerous for global strategy.
We'll be digging into historical patterns, looking at modern diplomacy, even some very recent incidents that kind of highlight how complex it all is.
Okay.
Our goal here isn't to take sides, definitely not to judge. It's really about helping you understand the dynamics so you can form your own views based on the facts.
All right, let's get into it. So why is this idea, this China only understands strength thing, why is it so attractive to so many people?
Well, a big piece of it, I think, comes down to China's political system itself. We're talking about a highly centralized Leninist party state.
Right.
Think of it maybe like a giant company where there's one super powerful CEO, in this case, the Communist Party, holding all the reins, making all the big decisions.
I think I can picture that.
And that kind of structure, it often leads to very pragmatic, very results-focused decisions, which from the outside can easily look like a survival of the fittest kind of approach.
That makes sense. Yeah, it definitely projects this image of like iron will, and then there's that whole wolf warrior diplomacy thing we hear about.
Precisely. That's become a really common term. It refers to the shift towards much more aggressive language, public confrontations from Chinese diplomats.
Yeah, you see those clips sometimes.
It's a really noticeable change from their older, more reserved style. And it absolutely feeds that might makes right impression for the rest of the world.
Definitely feels like they're flexing, putting that assertiveness right out there.
And another factor, interestingly, comes from cultural studies. There's this framework, Hofstede's cultural dimensions.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It puts China really high on something called power distance. Their score is about 80, which is quite a bit higher than most Western democracies.
And what does that mean exactly? High power distance.
It basically signifies a greater acceptance of hierarchy, of inequality within the society. People are more comfortable with the idea that power isn't distributed evenly.
Ah.
Now, outsiders can interpret that as the strong call the shots, but really it primarily describes how accepting a society is of that hierarchy. It doesn't automatically mean a disregard for right or wrong. It's more about accepting authority.
Gotcha. And then you see China getting more and more influential in global organizations like the UN, the WHO, that also fits the narrative, right?
It does. That rapid expansion of influence often gets seen as classic power shapes the order logic in action. It sends a strong signal.
Okay.
So yeah, all these things together, they really paint a picture that leads many to believe China prioritizes strength above, well, almost everything else.
So, okay, we've covered why the idea feels true. Now let's dig into the actual evidence. What empirical observations seem to back this up?
Well, let's start with that high power distance score again. That 80 on Hofstede's scale. It really does highlight a cultural acceptance of power differences. And from outside, yeah, it can definitely lead you to think, okay, the stronger player sets the rules here.
And you mentioned public opinion, too, like what people inside China prioritize.
Right. Big surveys, like the World Value Survey or the Asian Barometer, these track global attitudes. They've consistently found something interesting. Chinese respondents, much more often than people in Western countries, tend to prioritize maintaining social order over things like protecting freedom of speech.
Huh. Like keeping things running smoothly is more important than individual expression, maybe.
Kind of. You could use your traffic analogy again.
Yeah.
Prioritizing smooth traffic flow for everyone over letting each driver do exactly what they want.
Right.
And outsiders often read that as, okay, strength and effectiveness matter more than traditional ideas of legitimacy or rights.
That's a great way to put it. And diplomatically, that wolf warrior thing, it's not just tough talk, is it?
No. Definitely not. It often translates into actual actions. Things like economic coercion, trade restrictions, tariffs, and direct, sometimes quite harsh, verbal attacks on other countries or their policies. It projects this national image, this posture, that's very sensitive about appearing weak. The focus seems to be heavily on deterrence. Don't mess with us.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, how China seems to, switch up its style depending on who they're talking to.
It's quite fascinating, actually. Beijing's rhetoric often shifts quite dramatically. When they're dealing with, say, perceived stronger nations, the U.S., the EU, the language tends to be about cooperation, mutual benefit, respecting core interests, more peer-to-peer language.
Okay.
But then when interacting with smaller or perceived weaker neighbors, you often see more assertive actions. More Coast Guard patrols in disputed waters, gray zone tactics, things that intimidate without triggering a full military response, and clear shows of force.
So it really looks like, from the outside, China talks rules to the big guys, but uses force with the little guys. That's the conclusion lots of people draw.
It's a very common observation, yes. But as we're about to get into, it's an observation that needs a lot more nuance. Because the world, well, it's rarely that black and white, is it?
Right. So that brings us nicely to the counter-arguments. Why is just saying they only see strength maybe too simple or even, like you said, dangerous?
Exactly. Let's challenge that simplification. First off, if you look at China's official way of talking about itself, its self-narrative, it's not purely about power.
Okay.
They consistently bring up things like the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, sovereign equality, non-interference, peaceful coexistence, stuff like that. And they always talk about mutual benefit and win-win.
But is that just talk? Like just rhetoric?
Well, maybe. But even if you think it's just instrumental rhetoric, the very fact that Beijing feels the need to use this kind of language, this normative vocabulary, this legitimacy talk, it shows they understand it matters for their international image.
Ah, right. If it was only about strength, they wouldn't bother with the nice words.
Precisely. And look at global public opinion. We mentioned Pew surveys earlier. Despite China's undeniable rise in power, positive views of the country globally are actually quite low, hovering around 36-37% median.
Wow, that's not high.
No. And most countries report not trusting President Xi Jinping on international affairs. Now, if power alone automatically brought respect, you'd expect those numbers to be way higher. The fact that they're not really challenges that simple strength equals respect idea.
That's a really good point, data versus perception.
And internally, within Chinese society itself, there's a strong focus on moral legitimacy, too. Concepts like anti-hegemony, meaning opposing dominance by one superpower, anti-colonialism, support for the global south, the absolute importance of sovereignty. These are deeply held values.
You see that play out sometimes, right? Like on issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict. Chinese public opinion and diplomacy often lean towards that anti-hegemony angle. It's not just about who has more tanks.
Exactly. It shows there are other frameworks influencing their views. And even in academic circles, scholars like Alistair Ian Johnston argue that China's strategic thinking isn't just one thing. It's diverse, drawing on different historical traditions, not just a single might makes right perspective.
Okay. And back to that Hofstede score, the high power distance one.
Right. We need to be careful there. It shows an acceptance of power differences, yes. But it doesn't automatically mean people disregard right and wrong entirely.
Yeah.
Chinese people themselves talk constantly about right and wrong and justice. Think about nationalism, historical grievances, debates about social fairness. Those concepts are powerful, even if they define them differently than maybe Western liberal traditions do.
So it's way more layered than just strength rules.
Absolutely. It's really not a simple formula at all.
Okay, so given all this complexity, all these layers, what's the smart play? How should other countries actually engage with China? What does that strength, respect, clear boundaries thing look like in, real life?
Well, the core idea is kind of straightforward conceptually, even if it's hard in practice.
Yeah.
You need to show credibility. You need to show capability. That earns a basic level of respect.
Okay, baseline respect through competence.
Right. Then you strategically use language that Beijing understands and uses itself terms like mutual benefit, core interests, non-interference. Use that language to frame both your absolute red lines and the areas where you see potential for cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, your bottom lines on things like technology security and your key relationships, like with the U.S., they have to be absolutely crystal clear. No ambiguity.
Sounds like walking a tightrope. How do countries actually do that? Can you give some practical examples?
Sure. Okay, first, when you're defining those red lines, let's say it's about national security tech or defense cooperation, translate them into Beijing's vocabulary. Frame them as your core interests.
Use their term back at them.
Exactly. Say, this involves our core interests, so we need strict boundaries here. Using terms like core interests or arguing for equal benefit tends to land better institutionally in Beijing than just making purely moral arguments about right and wrong.
So speak their bureaucratic or institutional language to make sure the message gets through clearly. That's clever.
It's about effective communication. Second, you have to maintain observable capability and resolve. That means deterrence, both being able to deny them success and being able to impose costs if they cross lines.
So show you have the means and the will.
Right. Chinese decision makers value credibility highly. You don't necessarily need to be provocative, but it has to be completely unambiguous that crossing certain lines will have consequences. It's about predictability, really.
Predictability makes sense in any relationship, right? Big or small.
Totally. Third, get granular with tech, infrastructure, and data. Cooperate where it's low risk, maybe green energy, agriculture, healthcare. But for the really sensitive stuff, semiconductors, AI, dual-use tech, critical data, you need very strict screening, very clear rules, non-transferability clauses.
So open doors where it's safe, build high fences where it's not.
Yeah.
Got it.
Fourth, aim for selective reciprocity, not just wide open doors. If you open your market somewhere, demand similar access in return. Avoid becoming overly dependent in one direction.
Makes sense. Don't get trapped.
Fifth, think about public messaging. If you're trying to communicate to a broader Chinese audience, framing arguments around order, security, mutual benefit often works better. Just delivering purely moral judgments can sometimes backfire, seen as interference or Western double standards.
So tailor the message. Don't just preach Western values. Frame it in terms that resonate more with their own cultural context.
Exactly. And this applies to the U.S. factor, too. When coordinating with the U.S., frame it as following established rules or international norms, not just acting out of, say, distrust of China. Tech transfer limits, for example, can be presented as based on agreed international standards.
Okay.
And maybe one final tactic. Think soft language, hard clauses. Publicly, use positive cooperative language. Partnership, mutual benefit. But in the actual legal agreements, the contracts for tech, data, supply chains embed very strict, very specific, enforceable clauses.
Nice. On the surface, ironclad underneath.
It's a way to address both the need for strength and the importance of normative language in China's system.
Okay, let's try and bring some history into this. This idea of bowing to the strong, bullying the weak. Does China's history actually show that pattern? Let's start with the bowing to the strong part.
Oh, absolutely. The most prominent example is what China calls its century of humiliation, roughly 1839 to 1949.
Right.
This is a period marked by a whole series of unequal treaties. Nanjing, Tianjin, the Boxer Protocol, basically forced on China after military defeats by Western powers and Japan.
These weren't negotiations, they were dictates.
Exactly. They resulted in China losing territory, like Hong Kong, vast lands to Russia, paying huge indemnities, losing control over its own tariffs. China was in a position of weakness, facing technologically superior powers, and was forced to make concessions.
Yeah, you can picture a nation just backed into a corner having to sign things just to survive. And even later, right? Like in the Cold War.
Mao Zedong's decision to meet Richard Nixon in 1972, that was a huge strategic pivot. It was about aligning with the U.S., a superpower, to counterbalance the threat from the Soviet Union, another superpower. It's a very pragmatic move, a compromise driven by recognizing the power realities of the time.
Okay, so clear examples of adjusting to superior strength. Now, what about the flip side? The bullying weaker nations idea.
Well, you can look way back to ancient China's tributary system. For centuries, this was the dominant model in East Asia.
How did that work?
It was a hierarchical system. Neighboring states, Korea, Vietnam, others were expected to send missions, pay tribute, and essentially acknowledge China's preeminence, its sort of superior status. It wasn't always direct military coercion, but it was definitely an institutionalized system based on a massive power imbalance. China was the center.
Like the big kid on the block expecting everyone else to defer just because they were bigger?
Something like that. And fast forward to modern times. Think about the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. Beijing explicitly framed that as teaching Vietnam a lesson or punishing it for its actions in Cambodia.
Wow, punishing.
And today, look at the South China Sea. We see constant reports of China's Coast Guard, sometimes maritime militia, assertively patrolling, using water cannons, harassing fishing boats from Vietnam, the Philippines. It's using shows of force and these gray zone tactics below the threshold of war to assert claims over disputed islands and waters against smaller neighbors.
It's not just military stuff, right? There's economic pressure, too.
Oh, absolutely. That's become a huge part of it.
Like the Sri Lanka port situation. Hambantota.
That's a classic example people point to.
Yeah.
China financed and built the port. It wasn't commercially successful. Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans. And eventually, China took control of the port on a 99-year lease.
Yeah.
It's widely cited as potential debt trap diplomacy, where financial leverage leads to strategic concessions or loss of assets.
Or like Angola. Getting huge loans for infrastructure, but having to pay back with oil and then having Chinese companies mandated for most of the work.
Exactly. That creates deep economic dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
Critics argue it becomes a kind of modern unequal relationship where the terms heavily favor the lender.
And you see it in really small nations too, right? Like Mauritania, Comoros. They rely so heavily on Chinese aid and investment for basic infrastructure that pushing back becomes almost impossible.
It gives Beijing significant leverage. And then there's Equatorial Guinea, a very small country where China's been involved in military sales, building naval facilities. There's even talk of a potential Atlantic military base. It looks like establishing strategic footholds in vulnerable places.
So yeah, these cases really do seem to paint a picture of using that power imbalance, whether military or economic.
They definitely illustrate a pattern, historically and currently, of interacting very differently depending on the perceived strength of the other party.
Which brings us right back to that core provocative question. Does China only understand fists? Why do people land on such a strong, definitive statement?
Well, all that historical experience we just talked about, this century of humiliation, that leaves a deep scar. It fosters this powerful narrative internally. Weakness invites exploitation. Being soft doesn't work.
So history teaches a hard lesson.
And then you have more recent examples that seem to reinforce it. Look at Australia in 2020. They called for an independent inquiry into COVID's origins. China hit them with major trade sanctions.
I remember that.
But Australia didn't back down. They rallied international support from other democracies. And eventually, China quietly eased most of those restrictions. The perception was toughness worked.
And wasn't there something similar with India after that border clash in 2020?
Right. India responded quite forcefully, military buildup, banning lots of Chinese apps. And the result, reports suggest China actually de-escalated the situation on the border. Again, the takeaway for many was pushback gets results.
So recent events seem to feed the strength narrative, too.
They do.
Yeah.
And culturally, there's this concept in Chinese tradition, shi. It's complex, but it relates to power, momentum, the strategic advantage. The idea that the strong, those with shi, are naturally respected. Their actions carry more weight. There's even that famous, maybe attributed quote from Confucius. Few are won over by virtue. Many are won over by power.
Yeah, okay. But surely it's not always just about force, right? You mentioned costs, economic interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Critics of the simple fist theory point out that China is responsive to costs and risks. When the U.S. put on tariffs or restricted tech exports, Beijing did adjust. It became more cautious in some areas. And look at the EU and China. They still negotiate complex trade deals, investment agreements. They use rules, treaties, diplomacy. It's not all just shows of force. Economics clearly matters. It's not always a fist fight.
Okay. And speaking of fists, there was that wild video going around recently.
Ah, yes, the Mongolia incident.
Yeah, where this guy, supposedly a Chinese patriot, is in Mongolia waving a Chinese flag, yelling, "Mongolia is China's territory." And then, bam! The locals apparently reacted very physically. Reports said he lost some teeth.
Right. Now, it's really important to stress this was a viral social media video. Its authenticity, the full context, hasn't been independently verified by major news outlets.
Okay, fair enough. Viral videos can be misleading.
But symbolically,
Yeah.
it does illustrate something potent. In very specific, highly charged situations, especially around national identity, sovereignty, historical wounds, immediate visceral reactions can happen before any calm debate.
So it's a powerful image for sure, but it doesn't mean all Chinese people are like that or only respond to force. It taps into deep nationalist feelings and tensions on both sides.
Precisely. It's a snapshot of intense emotion, not a universal rule.
Okay, so we've gone through the arguments, the history, the nuances. Let's bring it all together. Strategically, what are the big takeaways? How should nations actually try to manage this incredibly complex relationship with China?
Yeah, what's the practical advice here?
What should countries be doing?
Okay, first, it seems clear that building and maintaining a solid backbone of strength is essential. That means both military readiness and economic resilience.
Like we see Japan, India, Vietnam doing, strengthening defenses, diversifying economies.
Exactly. They're actively doing that, often working together with partners. Which brings us to the second point. Multilateral alliances are crucial. Groups like AUKUS, the Quad, G7 cooperation, these help countries avoid being isolated. They diversify supply chains and prevent Beijing from sort of picking off countries one by one.
Strength in numbers. Makes total sense, especially against a power known for trying to divide and conquer.
Absolutely. Third, countries need to be incredibly precise about their red lines, but also clearly identify where cooperation is possible.
So be firm, but not totally confrontational.
Right. Be unambiguous about boundaries. Europe's stance on 5G or advanced chips is a good example, but still find ways to work together on global challenges, like climate change. And crucially, avoid situations where China gains unilateral leverage. For instance, ensuring countries taking Belt and Road funds have diverse financing options, so they aren't solely dependent on Beijing.
Okay.
Fourth, information matters. Transparency is key. Countries need to guard against influence operations, propaganda, and economic deals that might look good short-term, but hide long-term geopolitical risks. Public awareness is vital.
Know what you're getting into.
And fifth, sometimes you do have to be prepared to demonstrate toughness. Australia's resilience against those sanctions is often cited. They stood firm, international opinion swung against Beijing's actions, and ultimately, China backed down somewhat. Taiwan's approach to building diplomatic space through tech leadership and democratic values shows another way to handle pressure effectively.
So, okay, pulling this all together for you, the listener.
Yeah.
What's the final thought here? How should we think about this worship of strength idea?
Well, what we've talked through today really suggests that boiling China down to only seeing strength might feel simple, maybe even useful tactically in some moments. But as an overall strategy, it's probably too simplistic, even dangerous.
Right.
Truly effective management seems to require both things. Clearly signaling your own strength in your non-negotiable lines and framing those messages using language that resonates within China's own system, its own normative vocabulary.
It really is a complex dance, isn't it? And just to be super clear, our conversation here, it's not about criticizing any nation or group of people. Not at all. It's about laying out observations, facts, different perspectives for you to consider and, make up your own mind.
And it definitely leaves us with some big questions to chew on, doesn't it? Like, in the real world of international politics, what actually brings more respect? Is it talking sense diplomacy, shared values? Or is it showing strength, economic muscle, military power?
Yeah, and do we sometimes fall into that might makes right trap ourselves without even realizing it?
That's a tough one. And how do you effectively deal with a culture that clearly does place a high value on strength? Do you just mirror it, stay tough all the time? Or is there a more sophisticated way, a way to make them feel respected perhaps, while still firmly preventing them from pushing too hard?
Is there a third way? Something more, civilized, beyond just trading punches or getting stuck in endless arguments?
Lots to think about. We encourage you to mull it over, maybe share your thoughts with us, maybe even dig into some sources yourself.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear what you think. And hey, if you enjoyed this Sip and Talk, please make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And definitely check out our good friend Mickey's YouTube channel. It's called Mickytolife. Seriously, he's got hilarious memes, great music finds, some really fun wine tasting reviews, and fantastic travel vlogs. You will not regret it.
That's Mickytolife. M-I-C-K-Y.